Keanu Reeves stepped into a high-end motorcycle dealership in a city far from home, where he was set to begin filming his next big project. Dressed in a simple outfit with a cap pulled low over his face, he blended into the background, just another unassuming visitor. To the salesperson, he was nothing more than a time waster, just another window shopper who had no business being in a place meant for real customers. But what was about to unfold would not only shatter the salesperson's assumptions, but also reveal a shocking truth that would leave everyone in the room stunned. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because we have another special one coming tomorrow. Let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. We have another incredible one coming tomorrow. After a long day on set, Keanu Reeves decided to make the most of the sunny afternoon by exploring the small, quiet town. With a simple cap pulled low over his face, he wandered the peaceful streets, taking in the charm of the local shops and the unhurried pace of life. But despite the tranquility, something felt missing. His motorcycle, his trusted companion, was back in Los Angeles, leaving a void that no amount of scenic beauty could fill. Riding wasn't just a hobby for Keanu. It was a part of who he was. The feeling of the wind against his face, the deep rumble of the engine beneath him. It was freedom. And right now, he needed that freedom more than ever. Riding wasn't just a pastime for Keanu. It was a part of his soul. The rush of the wind against his face, the deep growl of the engine beneath him, and the endless freedom of the open road. These were the things that made him feel truly alive. And at this moment, he craved that feeling more than anything else. That's when he saw it. At the end of the street stood a striking dealership, its golden sign gleaming under the afternoon sun. Aurora Motors. The building's sleek, modern facade was made almost entirely of glass, showcasing an array of high-end motorcycles, each sitting like a work of art on illuminated pedestals. This was it. If there was anywhere he could find what he was looking for, it was here. Keanu stepped through the automatic doors, and a soft chime echoed through the air, announcing his arrival. The moment he entered, he was struck by the sheer elegance of the place. The white marble floors gleamed under the soft showroom lights, reflecting the meticulously polished motorcycles displayed like priceless sculptures. Every inch of the store radiated exclusivity, a place designed not just to sell bikes, but to showcase status. Keanu took his time, walking through the showroom, his fingers lightly tracing the air above some of the finest machines he had ever seen. Each one was a masterpiece, a perfect fusion of power and design. But just as he was beginning to admire a particular model, a cold, clipped voice cut through the moment. "Good afternoon." Keanu turned to see a salesman approaching with measured, deliberate steps. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. His expression was controlled, his posture rigid, the kind of demeanor that hinted at an air of superiority. From the very first glance, it was clear. This man wasn't just here to sell motorcycles. He was here to decide who deserved to buy them. The salesman's suit was pristine, his posture rigid, and his expression, a carefully constructed mask of forced professionalism, laced with undeniable superiority. "May I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but devoid of genuine warmth. Keanu, unfazed, adjusted his cap and kept his voice steady. "I'm looking for a motorcycle to buy. Something classic, perhaps. A bike that blends power with freedom." The salesman's eyebrow arched slightly as he took a slow, deliberate glance at Keanu. From the worn cap to the simple clothes and relaxed posture. To him, this man didn't belong here. He offered a small, calculated smile, but there was something thinly veiled in his expression, an unspoken assumption. "Ah, of course," he finally said, his voice carrying a hint of condescension. His words were polite, but his eyes told a different story. The salesman's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. His words were wrapped in a thin veil of false cordiality, but the condescension in his tone was unmistakable. "Well, Our motorcycles are exclusive, you know. We only deal with high-standard models. Our clients are typically those looking for something truly special." He paused deliberately, letting his words hang in the air. The message was clear. Keanu wasn't that kind of client. Keanu, however, remained unfazed. He was used to this. People had judged him by his simple appearance countless times before. It never bothered him. "I understand," he said evenly. "Do you also work with rentals? Just curious." The salesman's reaction was instant. A short, dry chuckle escaped his lips, almost a scoff. "No, sir, we definitely do not deal with rentals." The way he said it, the slight curl of his lips, the dismissive flicker in his eyes, it was more than just an answer. It was a statement. Keanu had just confirmed what the salesman already assumed. He wasn't a serious buyer. The salesman straightened his suit jacket slightly, his expression unreadable, but his words dripping with thinly veiled arrogance. "Aurora Motors is a luxury dealership, sir. Our clients don't just buy motorcycles, they invest in them. Our bikes require a considerable commitment." He let the words settle, his gaze subtly flicking over Keanu's simple attire, as if reinforcing the idea that someone dressed like him didn't belong here. Then, with an almost patronizing smile, he added, "But perhaps I can show you some more basic options." Keanu caught the insinuation immediately. The salesman wasn't just suggesting a cheaper model. He was making it clear that he didn't believe Keanu could afford anything beyond the most entry-level machines. A lesser man might have taken offense. But Keanu? He simply took a slow breath, allowing the moment to pass without reaction. His expression remained calm, his voice steady. "Thank you," he said smoothly. "But I'd like to see the best models you have. I'm interested in something special." The salesman's eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected Keanu to back down, to accept his judgment and quietly leave. But instead, the man in front of him held his ground effortlessly. The salesman's smile thinned. He was annoyed now. This wasn't how this conversation was supposed to go. With a stiff nod, he took a step to the side. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying an edge. "But I must warn you, our motorcycles aren't for just anyone." The salesman stepped aside, motioning for Keanu to follow. His movements were stiff, calculated, as if he were reluctantly indulging a customer who didn't belong. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable air of superiority. "But I must warn you, our motorcycles are not for just anyone." The way he said it made it clear. He wasn't just talking about the bikes. After leading Keanu across the gleaming showroom floor, they stopped in front of an imposing Ducati Panigale Vi4, a machine that looked like it belonged more on a racetrack than a dealership. Its sharp, aggressive design and cutting-edge technology made it a beast on two wheels. The salesman extended his arm in an almost theatrical gesture, as if unveiling a priceless artifact. "This," he declared, "is the Panigale 5-4, one of our most sophisticated models. It is the perfect combination of impeccable design and the highest level of engineering." Then, with a sideways glance at Keanu, his lips curled into a barely concealed smirk. "It's a motorcycle for those who truly understand what they're buying and who appreciate exclusivity." It was subtle, but the implication was crystal clear. He didn't think Keanu fit that category. But Keanu? He simply tilted his head slightly, studying the bike with quiet confidence. He had nothing to prove. The salesman's smirk lingered as he observed Keanu's reaction, as if waiting for him to be intimidated by the prestige of the Ducati. Keanu studied the bike closely, his fingers hovering just above the sleek surface. He admired its craftsmanship, its power, but it wasn't what he was looking for. With a slight shake of his head, he finally spoke. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice calm yet decisive. "But it's not for me. I want something more classic, something that connects me to the road." The salesman's smile faded. A sigh, a shift in posture, the flicker of impatience in his eyes was undeniable. Right. He exhaled, his tone noticeably cooler now. Perhaps something more basic is what you need. Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel, leading Keanu toward another section of the showroom. They stopped in front of a Harley-Davidson Fatboy 114, a bike known for its bold, muscular stance and chrome-accented details. The salesman gestured toward it with far less enthusiasm than before. "This is a Harley-Davidson Fatboy," he said flatly. "It's iconic, of course. A reliable model, nothing too extraordinary, but it might be more in line with what you're looking for." The words were polite, but the condescension was impossible to miss. Keanu ran his hand over the handlebars of the Harley, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingertips. Unlike the Ducati, this bike spoke to him. It wasn't just about power or exclusivity. It was about soul. A subtle smile formed on his lips as he took in the details, the weight of the machine, the way it was built not just for speed, but for the road itself. "This," Keanu murmured, almost to himself. "This is what I'm looking for. It has soul." The salesman's eyebrow shot up, and he hadn't expected that reaction. Most customers were drawn to the sleek, cutting-edge models, the ones that screamed status and luxury. But this man, he was looking for something deeper. The salesman quickly masked his surprise, replacing it with a smirk. "Well," he said, his tone once again dripping with arrogance, "if that's what you want, we can arrange a test drive." Then, after a calculated pause, he added with a mocking chuckle, "But I must warn you, our policy for test drives is strict. We don't just hand these motorcycles over to anyone." His smirk widened, as if testing Keanu's patience, waiting for him to react, to get defensive, to prove that he wasn't worthy. Keanu, he simply remained calm, because he had nothing to prove. Without another word, the salesman turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Keanu standing next to the Harley, the weight of his words still lingering in the air. But what the salesman didn't realize was that he had just made the biggest mistake of the day. The air was thick with tension. Would Keanu actually get the test drive? From the way the salesman had spoken, from the way he had sized Keanu up with thinly veiled condescension, it was clear. He wasn't just a gatekeeper. He was an obstacle. Keanu remained by the Harley-Davidson Fatboy, his fingers lightly resting on the handlebars. He wasn't impatient, nor did he seem affected by the salesman's dismissive attitude. Instead, he took his time, quietly observing every curve, every detail of the machine in front of him. But in the distance, the salesman was watching, and when he finally approached again, his expression was even stiffer than before, his movements sharper, his jaw tighter. A decision had been made. With a slow, deliberate motion, he adjusted the cuffs of his suit, as if preparing to deliver something absolute. "Sir," he began, his voice dripping with forced politeness, "I spoke with the manager, and unfortunately, we cannot—" He didn't even finish the sentence before his lips curled into a slight smirk, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The rejection. The confirmation that, in his eyes, Keanu didn't belong here. But what he didn't realize was that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. "I'm sorry, but we can't authorize the test drive." The salesman delivered the words smoothly, his tone firm, final. "Our policy is very clear on this." Keanu furrowed his brow slightly, inhaling slowly. His calm remained intact, but there was now a subtle shift in his demeanor, an edge of curiosity, of quiet challenge. "And what exactly is this policy?" he asked, his voice level, unwavering. The salesman let out an audible sigh, clearly irritated by Keanu's persistence. "Only customers who meet certain criteria are allowed to test our bikes." His words were clipped, deliberate. "This includes having the necessary experience to handle machines as powerful as these." Then, with an insincere smile, he added, "It's not a personal decision, of course, just following company rules." The implication was clear. He was still judging Keanu, still assuming. Keanu remained composed, but when he spoke again, his tone had shifted. Firmer now, more resolute. "I understand the need for safety," he said evenly. "But I think we can resolve this simply. He was about to offer a solution, but the salesman was already gearing up for another excuse. The walls weren't just policy. They were prejudice. "I'm sorry, but we can't authorize the test drive." The salesman delivered the words smoothly, his tone firm, final. "Our policy is very clear on this." Keanu furrowed his brow slightly, inhaling slowly. His calm remained intact, but there was now a subtle shift in his demeanor, an edge of curiosity, of quiet challenge. "And what exactly is this policy?" he asked, his voice level, unwavering. The salesman let out an audible sigh, clearly irritated by Keanu's persistence. "Only customers who meet certain criteria are allowed to test our bikes." His words were clipped, deliberate. "This includes having the necessary experience to handle machines as powerful as these." Then, with an insincere smile, he added, "It's not a personal decision, of course, just following company rules." The implication was clear. He was still judging Keanu, still assuming. Keanu remained composed, but when he spoke again, his tone had shifted, firmer now, more resolute. "I understand the need for safety," he said evenly. "But I think we can resolve this simply. He was about to offer a solution, but the salesman was already gearing up for another excuse. The walls weren't just policy. They were prejudice. Keanu held his ground, his expression steady. "I can assure you that I have the necessary experience to ride this motorcycle." The salesman's lips curled into a forced smile, but there was no warmth behind it, just thinly veiled condescension. "Oh, really?" he said, his tone carrying a hint of amusement, as if Keanu had just told a joke. He crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "And what exactly is that experience?" Then, with an exaggerated sigh, he added, "With all due respect, sir, riding a Harley-Davidson Fat Boy is not for everyone." His gaze swept over Keanu once more, a silent evaluation, a final judgment. Keanu, however, didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying the man in front of him. It was clear now. This wasn't about company policy. This wasn't about test drive regulations. This was a challenge. The salesman wasn't trying to follow rules. He was trying to prove a point. Keanu let a small breath out, his voice remaining measured, controlled, completely unshaken. "I've ridden all types of motorcycles in various situations," he replied, his tone carefully calculated, neither defensive nor boastful. "I believe this won't be a problem for me." But the salesman wasn't ready to back down just yet. His smirk remained, his body language still screaming superiority. He wasn't interested in facts. He was interested in proving that Keanu didn't belong. The salesman's demeanor hardened. He wasn't just enforcing policy. He was making a point. He was determined to belittle Keanu. With a tight-lipped smirk, he shook his head slightly. "I understand, sir," he said, his voice coated in false politeness. "But unfortunately, that's not enough." He took a step back, adjusting the cuff of his suit as if to subtly remind Keanu of his own status, his authority in this space. "We have responsibilities," he continued smoothly, "not just to our vehicles, but to our clients." Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he added, "We can't just release such an exclusive bike without the necessary guarantees." The way he said it, measured, deliberate, left no doubt. This wasn't about rules. This was about him. Keanu exhaled slowly, reining in any flicker of frustration. He had seen this before. This wasn't the first time someone had judged him based on appearance alone. His voice remained calm, controlled, but firm. "I'm not asking for privileges." He met the salesman's gaze, unwavering. "I'm asking for a fair chance to test the bike before buying. That's standard procedure, isn't it?" The salesman's smile faltered, just for a second. He hadn't expected resistance. He had assumed Keanu would back down, accept the rejection, and leave quietly. But Keanu wasn't leaving. He was standing his ground. For the first time, the salesman hesitated. It was subtle, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a brief pause before he spoke again. But just as quickly, he regained his composure, his expression hardening once more. He lifted his chin slightly, reasserting his authority. "Yes, sir. It is standard." A deliberate pause. "But only under appropriate circumstances." His voice remained steady, professional, but laced with superiority. "I need to follow the manager's guidelines," he added, his words carefully measured. "It's not personal, as I said before." Keanu studied him for a moment. It was personal. This wasn't about store policies or test drive regulations. This was about perception. The salesman had made his judgment, and he was determined to stand by it. For a brief moment, Keanu considered walking away. He didn't owe this man anything. He wasn't obligated to prove himself to someone who had already decided he wasn't worthy. But then, something inside him shifted. He had spent years watching people judge others based on appearance, wealth, or status. And most of the time, they got away with it. Not today. Because sometimes, standing your ground wasn't about proving a point to someone else. It was about proving a point to yourself. Keanu had seen this before. The salesman had already decided who he was, what he was worth, and whether he deserved to be there. But Keanu wasn't interested in playing along. "I understand," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. "But if you're going to follow these guidelines, I'd like to speak directly with the manager. I think he can clarify this policy better." The request was straightforward, logical. And yet, the salesman's expression shifted. The smugness disappeared. For the first time, he hesitated. He hadn't expected Keanu to push back. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face before he quickly recovered, straightening his suit as if to regain his authority. "The manager is very busy at the moment," he said coolly, his voice clipped, controlled. It was a dismissal, a final attempt to shut the conversation down. But Keanu didn't move. Instead, he simply tilted his head slightly, his stance unshaken. "That's fine." His tone was measured, deliberate. "I'll wait." And just like that, the dynamic in the room shifted. The tension in the showroom thickened. Other employees had started noticing the exchange, their eyes flickering toward the scene. Some whispered amongst themselves, while others pretended to be busy, though it was clear they were listening. The salesman's jaw tightened. He had been in control of this interaction from the start, until now. And he didn't like it. The energy in the showroom shifted. Employees stole quick glances from behind the counters. A few customers, pretending to browse, were now watching intently. They could sense it. Something was happening. Keanu took a step forward, his posture relaxed, but his presence now undeniable. And then, he asked the question that shattered the salesman's false confidence. "Let me be direct." His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "Is this really about the store's policy, or is it about what you think of me?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. For the first time, the salesman faltered. His eyes widened, just slightly, an instinctive reaction before he quickly tried to recover. But Keanu had already seen it. A flicker of uncertainty, a crack in the mask. He straightened his back, adjusting his suit as if to reassert his authority. "Sir, as I said, it's not personal," he replied, his voice carefully controlled. "We're just following our rules." But this time, Keanu heard it. A hesitation, a tiny shift in his voice, a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. He had struck a nerve, and they both knew it. Keanu had no intention of creating a scene, but he also had no intention of being dismissed without a valid reason. He remained where he was, next to the Harley-Davidson fat boy, his fingers lightly tracing the handlebar, his gaze still fixed on the machine. There was a quiet intensity to him, a presence that was impossible to ignore. A few feet away, Andrew, the salesman, stood with his arms crossed, his lips curled into a smug, nearly mocking smile. The showroom had fallen silent. The employees, the customers, everyone was watching now. The tension was thick, heavy. It wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a test. And Andrew? He was playing to win. With deliberate slowness, he adjusted his tie, then lifted his chin slightly, as if establishing dominance. "Sir," he began smoothly, his voice coated in thinly veiled superiority. "As I've mentioned before." His eyes flickered toward Keanu, assessing him once again, as if daring him to prove he belonged. "These motorcycles," he continued, his tone now heavier, more deliberate, "are not for just anyone." The words were calculated, designed to exclude, designed to provoke. But Keanu? He didn't flinch, because he had heard this before, and he knew exactly how this would end. Andrew's smug smile remained in place, his arms still crossed over his chest as he delivered his next words with measured arrogance. "These motorcycles aren't for just anyone, sir." He paused for effect, letting the words settle, as if reminding Keanu exactly where he stood. A certain level of experience and commitment is required to handle them. Another pause. "We're talking about high-performance machines." His tone was smooth, controlled, but the underlying message was unmistakable. "You're not good enough." Keanu finally looked up from the motorcycle, his eyes meeting Andrew's with a steady, unshaken gaze. His face remained neutral, unreadable, but there was something different now. A flicker of controlled irritation, a subtle shift in his expression that was barely noticeable, but unmistakably there. "I understand that," he said evenly. "But what exactly makes you believe I don't have enough experience?" His voice was calm, yet there was weight behind his words. Andrew chuckled. It was short, dismissive, as if Keanu had just said something ridiculous. With a mocking tilt of his head, he took a step closer, deliberately intruding on Keanu's space. His smirk widened, his tone dripped with false courtesy. "With all due respect, sir." But the way he said it, the slight pause, the careful enunciation, made it clear. There was no respect at all. Andrew's smirk deepened, his eyes scanning Keanu one more time, as if still trying to piece together why this man thought he belonged here. Then, with mock seriousness, he said, "Your appearance doesn't inspire much confidence." The words landed heavily, but Keanu didn't react. Instead, he simply waited. Andrew, emboldened by Keanu's silence, took a step closer, gesturing toward the Harley-Davidson Fat Boy with exaggerated flair. This Harley, for example, has a Milwaukee 8114 engine, high torque, serious power. His voice was slow, deliberate, like he was explaining something Keanu couldn't possibly understand. "And it's not something just anyone can handle." Another pause. "It requires practice. And more than that, it requires the right profile." The right profile. Keanu repeated the words softly, as if turning them over in his mind. He knew exactly what Andrew meant. But instead of reacting, he chose to give the man a chance to explain himself, to dig himself even deeper. Andrew shrugged, his expression full of mock sympathy, as if what he was about to say was just an unfortunate fact of life. His eyes flickered over Keanu's cap, his simple clothes, his unassuming posture. "You know how it is," he said smoothly. "Our customers tend to be people who value prestige and exclusivity. A polite way of saying, you don't belong." But Keanu? He just smiled, because he had heard this before, and he already knew how this was going to end. Andrew leaned in slightly, as if delivering a final truth, his smirk unwavering. "It's not just about riding the bike," he said smoothly. "It's about representing it. You understand?" Keanu was silent for a moment. He let the words settle, studying the man in front of him, taking in the arrogance, the assumptions, the entitlement. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, as if truly considering the statement, he finally spoke. "And what exactly makes you think I wouldn't represent this motorcycle?" The question landed like a challenge. Andrew blinked, caught off guard for the first time. For a brief second, his carefully constructed facade cracked, but then, just as quickly, he recovered. A forced smile spread across his face, a thin, fragile attempt to maintain control of the conversation. "Well, let's see," he drawled, his tone carrying mock contemplation. "You came in here asking about renting bikes." He lifted an eyebrow as if the very idea was laughable. "That's not something our regular customers do. They come here with the intent to buy." He let the words linger, his expression smug. People who belong here don't hesitate. It was subtle, but Keanu saw it for exactly what it was. This wasn't about company policy. It was about gatekeeping. And Andrew? He had just walked straight into Keanu's game. Andrew let out a small huff of amusement, his smirk deepening as he swept his gaze over Keanu one more time, head to toe, slow and deliberate. Then, with a casual shrug, he added, "Let's just say, your style is a bit too casual for Aurora Motors." The insult was wrapped in politeness, but Keanu knew exactly what it meant. For a brief moment, he considered ignoring it. But then, why should he? He took a slow, measured breath, keeping his irritation in check. Then, with an almost amused expression, he looked Andrew in the eye and said, "So, basically, you're saying I don't look like I can afford or handle this bike, right?" The words were calm, but they hit their mark. Andrew's smirk twitched for a fraction of a second. Then he laughed again. But this time, he didn't bother disguising the sarcasm. "Oh no, don't get me wrong, sir." His voice was smooth, almost mocking. "I just believe this bike requires a certain kind of commitment." Another deliberate pause. And so far, he let his gaze flick over Keanu again, this time with open condescension. "I haven't seen anything that suggests you're up to it." The atmosphere in the showroom had shifted. The conversation was no longer just between Keanu and Andrew. Other customers and employees had taken notice. The whispers were discreet, but constant. An older man standing near a Triumph motorcycle crossed his arms, his gaze flickering between the two men. His expression was a mix of curiosity and clear disapproval. Keanu, sensing the shift, took a slow, deliberate step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance. Then, keeping his tone low, steady, but undeniably sharp, he locked eyes with Andrew and said, "Don't you think you're being a bit quick to judge someone you've just met?" The words were calm, but they landed with unmistakable weight. For the first time, Andrew hesitated. It was only for a second, a flicker of uncertainty, a brief break in his carefully controlled demeanor. But it was there. And Keanu saw it. Everyone saw it. Andrew quickly recovered, straightening his posture, gripping the edge of his suit jacket as if reasserting control. His arrogance wasn't gone, but the cracks were beginning to show. Andrew straightened his posture, his confidence returning as he exhaled slowly. "Sir, I'm not judging," he said, his tone almost offended, as if Keanu had somehow wronged him by calling him out. "I'm just doing my job and protecting the interests of the store." He lifted his chin slightly, his voice taking on a rehearsed professionalism. "After all, it's my duty to ensure that our motorcycles are handed over to the right hands." Keanu let out a soft chuckle, humorless, cold. "The right hands," he echoed, as if tasting the words. Then, slowly, he took a step back, crossing his arms, studying Andrew, as if evaluating him for the first time. The tension thickened. Employees and customers weren't even pretending to browse anymore. All eyes were on them. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Tell me something." His voice was still low, steady but sharper now. Before drawing conclusions, shouldn't you at least give me a fair chance to prove my ability? Andrew's jaw tightened. For the first time, his confidence wavered. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He forced a smirk, trying to regain control of the situation. But everyone in that room knew he was losing. Andrew let out a slow breath, straightening his shoulders as if reasserting his authority. Sir, these motorcycles are not toys. His voice was measured, clipped, each word carefully chosen. And the test drive isn't something we just hand out to anyone. He paused, his gaze flickering over Keanu once more before delivering his next words with pointed emphasis. Especially when there's no guarantee that the client can, in fact, purchase the vehicle. The silence that followed was almost deafening. A few employees shifted uncomfortably. Customers glanced at each other, their interest in the unfolding confrontation now undeniable. But Keanu? He didn't move. He simply stared at Andrew, holding his gaze for a long, deliberate moment. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. And then, finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, controlled, but piercing. And what exactly makes you believe I can't buy this motorcycle? The question landed like a stone in still water. Andrew's fingers twitched, his carefully constructed mask of confidence now cracking at the edges. Instinctively, he reached up to adjust his tie, a nervous reflex he didn't even seem aware of. He took a small step back, subtle, but noticeable. For the first time, he wasn't just defending his authority. He was defending himself. Still, he forced a tight-lipped smile, trying to regain his footing. Well, he began, his voice just slightly off balance. But everyone in that room already knew. He had lost control of the conversation. Andrew let out a slow breath, his confidence returning. Or at least, he wanted it to seem that way. With a tight-lipped smile, he spoke, his tone silky smooth, but dripping with condescension. Don't take this the wrong way, but our customers usually demonstrate a certain lifestyle that accompanies these machines. He paused just long enough to let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. It's something that, with all due respect, doesn't seem to be your case. The way he said it, the careful phrasing, the faux politeness, only made it worse. And this time, he wasn't the only one being watched. The shift in the room was palpable. More people had stopped pretending to browse. An older gentleman who had been silently watching for some time shook his head in disapproval, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. A younger customer, standing near a Triumph, muttered something under his breath to his wife, who looked equally uncomfortable. Andrew had been so focused on belittling Keanu, he hadn't noticed. But Keanu? He had. Without breaking eye contact, Keanu took a step forward. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't confrontational, but it was deliberate. The kind of movement that shifts the balance of power without a single word. The smirk on Andrew's face faltered, just slightly. Because suddenly, for the first time, he wasn't in control anymore. Keanu closed the distance slightly, his posture still relaxed, but there was no mistaking the shift in energy. His voice remained calm, steady, but this time, there was an undeniable weight behind his words. Let me ask you something, Andrew. A pause. The room seemed to tighten around them. Is all this resistance you're showing really about the store's policy, or is it about what you think of me? The question landed like a punch. For the first time, Andrew's composure cracked. His eyes widened, just slightly, an involuntary reaction before he could suppress it. He opened his mouth, then quickly shut it again, as if choosing his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't quite as steady as before. Sir, as I've said, this isn't personal. He straightened his tie, trying to reassert control. We're just following our rules. But Keanu was already shaking his head. Rules. He let the word hang in the air for a moment, his gaze never leaving Andrew's. Then, his voice still quiet but razor-sharp, he added, Rules that you seem to be interpreting. Your way. A few employees shifted uncomfortably. A customer standing near a row of sport bikes let out a low whistle, as if sensing just how badly this was going for Andrew. And Andrew? He swallowed, his grip tightening on the edge of his suit. Because he knew. He had just lost control of the conversation. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression still calm, still controlled. But the sharpness in his tone was unmistakable. So far, all you've given me are excuses. A ripple of unspoken agreement moved through the showroom. The tension had reached its breaking point. Nobody was pretending to browse anymore. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked onto the confrontation, watching, waiting. Even the employees, who had initially avoided eye contact, now stood frozen behind their counters. And Andrew? He was starting to feel it. His carefully built facade of control was slipping. He opened his mouth, scrambling for a response, anything that could salvage his authority, but before he could get a single word out, a new voice cut through the air, firm, unyielding. What's going on here? The room shifted. All eyes turned toward the back of the showroom, where a tall, well-dressed man strode forward with purpose. His expression was serious, his presence commanding. Andrew stiffened immediately, his confidence visibly draining at the sight of the man approaching. Keanu didn't need an introduction. He already knew. The store manager had just entered the ring. The manager, James Carter, stood tall, his posture exuding authority. His eyes scanned the room, then settled on Andrew. His expression was firm, unreadable, but undeniably serious. I want to hear exactly what's going on. A single sentence, but it carried weight. Andrew swallowed hard. For the first time since this all began, he looked genuinely uneasy. He shifted his stance, straightened his suit, and cleared his throat. A nervous reflex. Mr. Carter, I was just explaining our test drive policy to the customer, Andrew began, his voice carefully measured. He insists on riding the bike, but... He hesitated. His usual confidence was gone. Keanu remained silent, watching. And so did the entire showroom. Everyone was listening. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. James Carter's gaze remained locked on Andrew. His brows furrowed slightly, sensing something wasn't right. The hesitation in Andrew's voice, the way the entire showroom had gone quiet, the way every single employee and customer was now waiting to see what he would do. But there was one problem. James Carter still didn't recognize Keanu, and that meant the question still remained. Would he handle this fairly, or would he too fall into the same trap? James Carter had been watching the exchange from a distance, his sharp eyes assessing the situation as it unfolded. At first, he had assumed it was just a routine dispute, a salesperson handling a difficult customer. But as he stepped closer, something shifted. His gaze landed on Keanu, and in an instant, he recognized him. The realization hit hard. His entire demeanor changed. The tension in his shoulders gave way to a sudden urgency, a silent understanding that this was no ordinary customer. This was Keanu Reeves, a man who didn't just ride motorcycles, he lived them, a man whose passion for bikes was world famous. And James, he had just walked into a disaster. Moving quickly, he stepped forward, his expression shifting from authority to controlled embarrassment. Mr. Reeves, he said, his voice suddenly smoother, more professional. He extended his hand, a mix of respect and damage control clear in his movements. I'm James Carter, the manager of this store. Andrew stiffened, his face going pale. A whisper of shock moved through the showroom. James took a breath, trying to maintain composure. But he knew. He had just inherited a mess. I apologize for not intervening sooner. His words were carefully chosen, because now the power dynamic had completely shifted, and everyone in that room knew it. James Carter extended his hand, his voice carrying measured authority. I would like to understand better what happened here. Directly from you. Keanu accepted the handshake, his expression remaining calm, composed. the kind of presence that had become synonymous with his reputation. He took a slow breath, then began to recount the events with quiet precision. "Thank you for stepping in, Mr. Carter." His tone was polite, but there was a weight behind his words. "As I was explaining, I entered this store interested in purchasing a motorcycle, but the conversation quickly turned into doubts about my ability and my intention, based on nothing more than assumptions made by your salesman." James listened attentively, and as he did, the discomfort on his face grew. Because now, he understood. He had walked into a situation far worse than he had anticipated. And now, with every passing second, the attention in the showroom intensified. By now, every customer and employee in the store was watching. Some stood near the display bikes, pretending to browse, but their eyes told a different story. They felt the weight of what was happening. And James? He could feel it too. Taking a deep breath, he finally spoke. "This does not reflect the values we uphold here at Aurora Motors." His voice was firm, but there was a note of controlled urgency, a need to correct this before it got worse. Slowly, he turned to Andrew, his gaze now hard, disapproving. "Our goal is to treat all customers with respect and impartiality, regardless of their fame or appearance." His words cut through the room, landing with undeniable weight. Andrew swallowed hard. His face had lost its smugness, replaced with visible tension. The reality of his mistake was setting in. He opened his mouth, perhaps to justify himself, perhaps to salvage what little authority he had left. But before he could speak, James cut him off. And suddenly, it was clear. Andrew wasn't in control anymore. Andrew barely got a word out before James lifted a hand, silencing him immediately. His expression was firm, unyielding. "That's not how we operate here, Andrew." The words were deliberate, final. Andrew froze, his jaw tightening. He had lost. And James, he wasn't about to let this situation spiral any further. Turning toward Keanu, he adjusted his stance, shifting from damage control to direct action. "I will personally arrange the test drive for Mr. Reeves." A few hushed murmurs rippled through the showroom. This was more than just an apology. This was a correction. "I want to ensure that he receives the treatment that any customer would deserve," James continued, his tone controlled but resolute. Then, with a slight pause, he added, "But especially someone who has clearly demonstrated both passion and respect for motorcycles, as Mr. Reeves has." Andrew's face was stone cold, but his clenched fists gave him away. He had been completely overridden. James turned back to Keanu, his voice now carrying a personal sincerity. "Please, allow me to correct this right away. I will ensure that your test drive happens without any further complications." And just like that, the situation had shifted. Keanu held his composure, his expression giving away nothing but quiet understanding. Then, with the same effortless calm he had maintained throughout the entire exchange, he nodded. "I appreciate your promptness, Mr. Carter." A brief pause. "It's refreshing to see that leadership is willing to step in and do what's right." James exhaled slightly, nodding in acknowledgement. With the tension now redirected toward resolution, he turned and gestured toward one of the employees. "Prepare the Harley-Davidson in the external parking lot." There was no hesitation in his voice. This was happening now. The employee hurried off, and within moments, the sound of a rumbling engine filled the air outside. James took a step back, motioning toward the exit. "Everything is ready for your test drive, Mr. Reeves." This time, his voice carried not just respect, but something else, an implicit apology, a silent acknowledgement of what had gone wrong. As Keanu turned toward the door, heading for the waiting motorcycle, the tension in the showroom didn't disappear. It had merely shifted, and now, all of it rested on Andrew. The tension in the showroom began to dissipate, but it didn't fade into silence. It turned into a buzz. Low voices murmured in hushed conversations, employees exchanging uncertain glances, customers whispering about what had just happened. But the message was clear. This wasn't just about Keanu Reeves. This was about how people should be treated, whether famous or not. Keanu, now seated on the Harley-Davidson Fat Boy, took one final glance back toward the showroom. His gaze landed first on James Carter, whose expression carried a silent acknowledgement of what had transpired. Then, his eyes found Andrew. No words were exchanged, but the silence said enough. It was a reminder that fairness and respect weren't privileges, they were expectations. Keanu gripped the throttle and started the bike. The deep rumbling growl of the engine filled the space, cutting through the remaining tension like a sharp blade. It was the perfect closing note, a final statement that needed no further explanation. Then, he was gone. As the doors of Aurora Motors faded in the distance, so did the weight of everything that had just happened. The roar of the Harley-Davidson Fat Boy was more than just sound. It was a symphony of freedom, a release. The tension, the judgment, the confrontation, all of it was behind him now. The quiet streets stretched out before him, wide and welcoming. The bike glided effortlessly, responding to every flick of his hands, every shift in his feet, like an extension of himself. This was what he had been missing. Not just the machine, not just the ride, but the feeling. Freedom, simplicity, connection. The elements that had always been at the core of who he was. As the wind rushed past, Keanu found himself reflecting on what had just happened. Because in the end, it wasn't about the motorcycle. It wasn't even about the test drive. It was about something far bigger. It was about how people saw him, and more importantly, how they saw each other. This wasn't a new experience. Keanu had seen it countless times before. How his casual appearance made people underestimate him. How they judged him before they knew him. But what truly bothered him, what lingered in his mind as he rode, was that this wasn't just about one salesman. It was about something bigger. A system that valued status over substance. A world where appearances dictated respect. Where prejudice outweighed humanity. Keanu exhaled, his grip tightening on the handlebars. Then, as the road opened up, something shifted. The city streets gave way to endless green fields, the occasional tree casting long shadows against the afternoon sun. The wind, unfiltered, untamed, rushed past his face, and in that moment, he felt it. Why he loved this. Why riding wasn't just a hobby. It was a connection. To the present. To himself. To something real. And that was something Andrew would never understand. The road eventually curved gently, leading Keanu to a small roadside cafe. The kind of place that didn't care who you were, only that you had a story to tell. He pulled up, the low rumble of the Harley slowing to a deep idle. With practiced ease, he parked near the entrance, cut the engine, and swung his leg over the bike. Before he could even remove his helmet, he felt it. Eyes on him. A group of young people sitting at a nearby table had gone quiet. One of them leaned forward, whispering urgently, "Hey, is that..." Another stared, blinking in disbelief as Keanu casually pulled off his helmet, running a hand through his hair. "No way." The voice was louder this time, filled with excitement. So much so that one of them nearly knocked over their drink. Keanu glanced in their direction, and he couldn't help but smile, because here, on this quiet road, away from the judgment of suits and salesmen, people saw him for who he was. Not a customer, not a status symbol, just Keanu. And that was all he ever needed to be. A soft gasp, a clatter, a nearly spilled cup of coffee. It's him. The whisper came from a young woman at a nearby table, her wide eyes locked onto Keanu. Her friend froze mid-sip, nearly choking as she turned to look. It's Keanu Reeves. Keanu caught the reaction out of the corner of his eye, a slight smile forming on his lips. It happened all the time, but it never stopped being humbling. With a small wave, he acknowledged them. Polite, effortless. Then, as if nothing had happened, He stepped up to the cafe counter and ordered a simple black coffee. Behind him, the group whispered amongst themselves, unsure whether to approach. Finally, one of them mustered the courage. "Excuse me." Keanu turned, facing a young man holding up a phone. His hesitation clear. "You're Keanu Reeves, right? I mean, we're huge fans of your work." Keanu's smile widened, warm and genuine. He nodded. "Yes, that's me. It's a pleasure to meet you." Something about his response disarmed them. Not just the words, but the way he said them. No rush, no pretension. Just Keanu. And suddenly the nervous energy melted away. They began talking, excited, animated. They spoke about their favorite movies, about how The Matrix had changed the way they saw action films, how John Wick had redefined the genre. Keanu listened, really listened. He nodded, thanked them for their kind words, even asked them genuine questions about what they enjoyed most in the films. One of them hesitated before blurting out, "You seem so laid back." The statement carried a hint of disbelief. "I mean, you're one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, but here you are, just riding a bike, stopping for coffee, like any ordinary person." Keanu chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm just a guy who likes to ride." Then, with a small shrug, he added, "No matter what I do in my career, these moments, out here, on the road, are what keep me connected to the world." The group fell silent for a second, taking in the sincerity of his words. Because Keanu wasn't just saying it, he meant it. And that was what made him different. Keanu took a slow breath, letting the moment sink in. "These moments on the road, they keep me connected to the world," he said, almost as if reminding himself. "This is where I feel most myself." The group nodded, still soaking in the interaction. Before parting ways, they took a few photos. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. And Keanu? He made sure to thank them for the conversation. Because for him, moments like these weren't just about a handshake or a picture. They were real. As he climbed onto the Harley, he turned back one last time, raising a hand in a casual wave. The group waved back, still watching in awe. Not just because they had met a Hollywood icon, but because of how human he was. Then, with a soft rumble of the engine, he was gone. Back on the road. As the wind brushed against his face, Keanu felt something shift inside him. A weight he hadn't realized was there lifted. It wasn't just about escaping the chaos of Hollywood. It wasn't even about riding. It was about connection. Real interactions, without filters, without judgments. That, he knew, was true wealth. Not the money, not the fame, but the way he treated others, and the way they treated him in return. And that's when it hit him. A thought, small at first, but growing stronger with every mile. What if what happened at Aurora Motors could be turned into something positive? The road ahead stretched endlessly, but Keanu's mind was already back in that showroom. Back to the way Andrew had judged him on sight. Back to the moment James Carter had recognized his mistake and stepped up. What if, instead of just moving on, he could do something about it? Something that lasted. With each curve of the road, the idea took shape. By the time Keanu rolled into town, his decision was clear. He pulled into the parking lot of Aurora Motors, the familiar glass-fronted dealership standing before him. Cutting the engine, he sat there for a moment, thinking. Then, without hesitation, he dismounted and walked inside. Keanu stepped off the motorcycle and walked back into Aurora Motors. The moment he entered, he could feel it. The air was thicker now, tense. Employees had stopped what they were doing. Customers turned subtly, pretending to browse but clearly watching. Behind the counter, James Carter stood with his arms crossed, his face composed but watchful. And at the back of the showroom, Andrew. The arrogant salesman stood rigid, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. But this time, the smugness was gone. replaced by a mix of frustration and discomfort. Keanu removed his helmet, holding it casually in one hand as he walked directly toward James. His posture was relaxed, but in his eyes, there was no mistaking the determination. When he finally spoke, his tone was even, steady. "I like the bike." A slight smile flickered across his lips. Then, before James could respond, Keanu added, "But before we discuss any purchase, I think we need to talk about something more important." James frowned slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Of course, Mr. Reeves. I'm listening." Keanu's gaze flickered toward Andrew, who immediately looked away. It was subtle, but obvious. Then, shifting his attention back to James, Keanu continued, "I want to talk about how you treat your customers." A hush settled over the room. Employees exchanged quick glances. A customer paused mid-step, pretending to check out a motorcycle, but listening intently. Keanu held James's gaze. "Because I believe today can be a turning point." He let the words hang for a moment. "Not just for me, but for everyone who walks through these doors." Andrew's shoulders stiffened. "James?" His expression shifted. What had started as an apology was turning into something much bigger, something that could change this store forever. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew Keanu Reeves wasn't just here to buy a motorcycle, he was here to make a statement. The entire store was silent, but it wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the kind that coiled around the room, thick with anticipation. The tension hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown heavier. James Carter, the store manager, stood near the counter, arms crossed, his eyes locked onto Keanu with a mix of curiosity and expectation. He had dealt with difficult customers before, but this felt different. At the back of the showroom, Andrew stood motionless. His usual arrogance was gone. Now, he looked uncomfortable, restless, his hands twitching slightly at his sides. Every so often, his gaze flickered toward Keanu, then away, as if avoiding the reality of what was happening. The employees? They were still pretending to work, flipping through invoices, organizing papers, wiping down displays. But their eyes kept darting back to the unfolding scene. Even the customers who had walked in for entirely different reasons were now watching intently. Some traced their fingers over the chrome finish of motorcycles, pretending to inspect them. But they weren't looking at the bikes. They were waiting, because everyone in that room knew something was about to happen. And Keanu, he was in complete control of the moment. Slowly, Keanu took a few steps forward. His helmet still rested in one hand. His stride was calm, effortless. But something in his eyes, something sharp, unreadable, made it clear. He was about to say something that mattered. James Carter, sensing the weight of the moment, offered a practiced smile, an attempt to ease the tension. "Mr. Reeves," he began smoothly, keeping his tone light, "I hope the test drive was satisfactory. The bike is incredible, isn't it?" Keanu nodded slowly. "It's an amazing machine, no doubt about that." A brief pause. Then, without breaking eye contact, he added, "But before we discuss the purchase," his voice was steady, but deliberate, "there's something I need to address." James Carter's smile faltered, just slightly. His posture stiffened, his head tilting slightly in interest. "Of course, sir," he said, regaining composure. "We're here to address any concerns you may have." But Keanu wasn't just another customer with concerns. And deep down, James knew it. Because whatever Keanu was about to say, it wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. And everyone in that showroom? They were about to witness it. Keanu took a deep breath. Then, he stepped forward. Not just toward James, but toward everyone in the showroom. In that moment, he wasn't just speaking to a manager or a salesman. He was addressing an entire system. His voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the conviction behind it. "From the moment I entered this store, I was treated as if I had no value. A hush settled over the room. James Carter shifted uncomfortably. Andrew? He pursed his lips, arms tightening over his chest, his body language screaming one thing. He wanted to disappear. Keanu's gaze remained steady. I was judged. His tone didn't rise, but the words landed with weight. By my appearance, by the fact that I was wearing simple clothes, by the fact that I asked a question that apparently didn't match your standards. A few employees exchanged quick, uneasy glances. James inhaled sharply, his discomfort growing. Because Keanu wasn't wrong, and everyone in that room knew it. Keanu turned, this time, looking directly at Andrew. The salesman stiffened. His arms, once confidently crossed, now loosened slightly, his fingers twitching at his sides. Keanu's voice remained level, unshaken. I understand the need to protect the store's assets. I understand that you want to ensure people treat these motorcycles with respect. A pause. Then, his words sharpened. But what happened here today? This wasn't about policy. It was about judgment, about prejudice, and that is not acceptable. James Carter's lips parted slightly, as if preparing to respond. But before he could, Keanu lifted his hand. A simple gesture. But it was enough to make James pause. Because Keanu wasn't done. His voice lowered, not in volume, but in intensity. The bigger problem, he said, his gaze sweeping across the showroom, isn't just the way I was treated. It's what this represents. His words hung in the air. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Keanu let the silence stretch before continuing. How many other people have been treated the same way? How many customers have walked through these doors, only to be judged before they even had a chance? Andrew looked away. James? For the first time. He looked unsure of what to say. Because Keanu's words weren't just calling out a mistake, they were holding up a mirror. And everyone in that showroom was being forced to look. Keanu's voice remained steady, unwavering. How many people have walked through these doors, only to be dismissed because they didn't look up to par? A beat of silence. Nobody moved. The truth in his words was impossible to ignore. Keanu took a slow breath, then added, This isn't just bad for business. His tone hardened, each word landing with precision. It's wrong. James Carter exhaled sharply, his fingers twitching slightly where they rested on the counter. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. And if this continues? His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. You won't just lose customers. You'll lose something far more valuable than money. A pause. Then, you'll lose the chance to connect people with their passion. James took a deep breath. His composure faltered, just for a moment. Then, regaining control, he squared his shoulders and spoke. Mr. Reeves? He hesitated. Then, with visible effort, he continued. Let me start by offering my sincere apologies. His voice was measured, controlled. But there was something else there, something real. There is no excuse for the way you were treated today. No excuse for any of my team's behavior that made you feel disrespected. He took another breath, then met Keanu's gaze head-on. I promise you, this will be addressed internally. For a moment, the tension in the room seemed to settle. But Keanu, he simply shook his head. I'm not interested in apologies. His voice was still calm, but this time, it carried a finality that couldn't be ignored. James Carter's brows furrowed, just slightly. Andrew, standing in the background, let out a breath he didn't even realize he was holding. Keanu continued, I don't want Andrew to be punished. Andrew blinked, visibly caught off guard. Keanu's expression remained unchanged. And I don't want this to end with a simple, sorry for the inconvenience. A pause. Then, I want something bigger. James tilted his head slightly, a flicker of confusion passing over his face. And what exactly do you suggest? Keanu crossed his arms, his stance shifting slightly. More firm, more decisive. I propose that you implement a training program for all employees. James blinked. Not just about customer service, but about empathy and respect. The words landed like a challenge. James Carter said nothing, but everyone in that room knew Keanu wasn't just making a suggestion. He was offering them a choice to change, or to stay exactly the same. Keanu's voice remained measured, but the conviction in his tone was undeniable. And I want you to take this public. James's expression stiffened slightly. Keanu continued. Show that you are committed to making this store a place where anyone, no matter their background, can walk in and feel valued. A heavy silence settled over the showroom. Not the tense kind from earlier. This was different. This was the kind of silence that preceded change. James Carter's gaze drifted downward, deep in thought. In the background, Andrew shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the hem of his suit jacket. He wanted to leave, to slip away, to disappear before this moment could become even more uncomfortable. But he knew. If he moved now, every eye in that room would follow him. So instead, he stood frozen, waiting, just like everyone else, for James's response. James took a slow breath, then finally spoke. I understand what you're saying, Mr. Reeves. His tone was careful, deliberate. And I admit, I've never considered something like this before. He exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly. I believe it's a valid proposal, but it won't be easy. A pause. Then, our customers have expectations, and changing our approach. He hesitated. Then, as if speaking the words out loud made them more real. Could be risky. Keanu gave a small, knowing smile. He had been expecting that. The real risk, James? A brief silence. Then, his voice dropped just slightly, controlled but cutting. The real risk is changing nothing. James's lips parted slightly, caught off guard by the simplicity of the statement. Keanu stepped forward, just enough to make his next words impossible to ignore. You have the opportunity to lead by example, to show that a business can be profitable and still treat every customer with dignity. His eyes locked onto James's. I'm not asking for the impossible. I'm asking for something necessary. James Carter's shoulders tensed slightly, because in that moment he realized something. This conversation wasn't just about today. It wasn't just about Keanu, or Andrew, or even Aurora Motors. It was about a choice that would define not just how his store was perceived, but the kind of leader he was going to be. And as his gaze flickered to the employees, who were now all watching him, waiting, he knew this moment would define everything. James Carter let out a slow breath. He knew this was bigger than just a single confrontation. It was about the future of the store. And more than that, it was about doing what was right. Finally, he nodded. Then, with conviction, he spoke. Mr. Reeves, you are right. A pause. Then, this is something that needs to be done. And if it means improving our customers' experience, if it means changing how we are perceived, then it's a risk worth taking. The words settled over the room. Then, James stepped forward. And with a firm, decisive motion, he extended his hand. I accept your proposal. A beat of silence. Then, Keanu shook his hand. For the first time, a small smile flickered across his face. It wasn't about winning. It was about change. And now, change was happening. Keanu held James's gaze, his voice steady. Thank you. I look forward to seeing how you turn this into reality. James gave a curt nod. Then, turning toward his employees, his expression hardened slightly. This wasn't just a promise to Keanu. It was a statement to everyone in that room. I want everyone to know, starting today, things will be different. We're going to rethink how we treat our customers and what we represent as a company. Andrew, still standing at the back, looked pale. He avoided making eye contact with Keanu, but it was clear. He felt the weight of what had just happened. James turned to him, his gaze sharp. Andrew. The salesman stiffened. James's voice was firm, measured. We will talk later about your behavior today. A pause. Then, this is not how we operate, and it never will be again. A hush fell over the room, because in that moment, everyone knew. Aurora Motors had changed, and it started today. James Carter's voice was firm as he delivered the final words. This is not who we are, and it's not who we will ever be. His statement hung in the air, echoing in the quiet showroom. Keanu glanced briefly at Andrew. The salesman's shoulders were stiff, his face unreadable, but his silence said everything. Keanu didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Andrew had a lot to think about. With that, Keanu turned and walked toward the exit. And as he did, something shifted. The air in the showroom, once thick with tension, now felt different. And then, a sound. Soft at first, then growing. Applause. It wasn't loud, wasn't over the top, but it was there. Some employees smiled, relieved. Some customers nodded in quiet approval. But every single person in that room understood. Something important had just happened here. Keanu had walked in as just another customer, but he was leaving as something else, a reminder, a symbol, that sometimes small actions create big changes. Keanu put on his helmet, swung his leg over the Harley-Davidson, and with a smooth, effortless motion, he started the engine. The familiar roar filled the air. Then, he waved and rode away. The road stretched ahead, endless and open. The wind pressed against him, cool and refreshing, and Keanu, he felt light, because today, he had gained something far greater than just a motorcycle. As the town faded in the distance, he let his thoughts drift. To the power of small actions, to how a single moment, a single stand, could create ripples beyond what anyone expected. And then, a thought surfaced. How many other places? How many other stores, other people, other situations, where a simple shift in perspective could mean the difference between judgment and understanding, between rejection and opportunity, between a lost customer and a changed world? A small smile tugged at his lips. This question mark. This was only the beginning. As he rode forward, the sun dipping low on the horizon, he knew. The journey was far from over. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, resilience, and change.